Hi, everyone. Welcome. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. We will give it a minute so that more people can join us. All right, I see that the numbers are increasing. Once again, welcome everyone. As people continue to join us, let me share some housekeeping rules. I am sure that most of you already know, but the webinar is being recorded. The recording will be available on our YouTube channel shortly, both for this webinar and all of our previous ones, so make sure to check them out. We will have, as usual, a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. We will be using Slido. We are not going to look at the Zoom chat, so please scan the QR code on screen or go to slido.com and use the code disinfo. To familiarize with the tool, we are starting with 2 questions. As usual, let us know where you're joining us from and what sector do you represent. And also remember that you can submit your questions at any time from this moment on, so do not wait until the last minute. We will come back to the questions after the presentation, again on Slido, not on the Zoom chat. I am Giovanna Sessa. I am the research manager at the EU DisinfoLab. We are a nonprofit organization gathering knowledge and expertise on disinformation in Europe, and we regularly organize these webinars to give voice to experts in our amazing community to help sharing knowledge and raising awareness around the great work that is being done by so many defenders. Since we are speaking of gender and identity-based disinformation, I take the opportunity to flag our most recent work on the topic. So we have produced guidelines for the European External Action Service on how to detect and analyze identity-based disinformation and FIMI. And this is a practical guide to conduct open source investigations in the field. But without further ado, let's now delve into today's topic. We are very excited to learn more about the Artemis Alliance, an international network of civil society organizations, and its work in particular in countering gender and identity disinformation, so GID, which is a sophisticated form of information manipulation targeting women, gender diverse individuals, and members of the LGBTIQ+ community. What is very important to remember, and we will learn it today with case studies from Armenia, Poland, and Georgia, is that this is not simply an individual issue, an issue of harassment of single persons, but it is a tool to systematically destabilize democracies and therefore should be understood as a national security threat. To navigate us through this very important topic today, we have Kate Zanner. She is a strategist and partnership broker specializing in cross-sector collaboration on conflict dynamics and societal resilience. As part of the Artemis Alliance, Kate works on countering gender and identity disinformation and build social cohesion and resilience against malign actors' interference. Her expertise spans Eastern Europe, Asia Pacific, and Middle East, and I'm sure that we will get it from the case studies that she will share. Welcome, Kate, and it is my pleasure to leave you the floor, and I will see you later for the Q&A. Enjoy.
Great. Thank you so much, MG. I'm going to try and share my screen, but I think that because of the screen recording, it's going to block me. So Maria, I might just ask you to help. Maria, wondering whether we could use your version of my presentation from your screen.
Yes, we can. You will have to bear a moment with me as I access it.
No problem. I thought we had sorted out the security settings, but I don't think we have.
Or otherwise, our colleague, also named Maria, behind the scenes, maybe can help us.
Yes, I'm opening it. Just a second.
Thank you, Maria. Sorry. MG, I'm referring to you as MG.
Yes, that's me. Apologies to the audience for this little hiccup. All right.
Great. Thank you very much, MG.
Apologies for taking a minute. So let me just know when I need to change the slide.
I will do. Thank you so much. And yes, sorry for the delay there. I'll let you get to presentation mode. There is some animation, so I'll just ask you to click through. So thank you so much for inviting me to talk. I was actually in the EU DisinfoLab conference in Riga at the last autumn, moderating a discussion about gender identity disinformation. And MJ and I have been talking since about the opportunity to talk about this as a very important issue and challenge to the disinformation space. So kindly let me join you today. So we're going to talk a bit about what is gender identity disinformation and why we see it as an urgent threat, exactly as MG outlined there in terms of a multi-vector threat. And then I'll talk a little bit about how we have been responding to that as a pilot program, particularly and deliberately focused on gender identity disinformation. And then we'll talk about emerging findings from our programming in terms of effective strategies or principles for countering GID. I'll talk for about 25 minutes and hope that there's lots of time for questions. So if you don't mind moving on and to the next slide, and MG, there's some animation here so you can bring through all the bullets. So you are a very knowledgeable audience about disinformation, and we are often in spaces talking and needing to explain disinformation. But as you will know, disinformation is a form of information manipulation, and gender and identity disinformation is deliberately spread information, false information about gender and sexual orientation. And it's used to discredit, intimidate and silence high-profile women, gender diverse and LGBT+ individuals, especially those in the public eye. So politicians, activists and journalists. And you'll see an image here of Salome Zurabishvili, the president or former president of Georgia, who has been the target of unrelenting gender-based disinformation attacks. Gender identity disinformation exploits kind of existing tensions around gender and sexuality in order to target vulnerable pop groups, vulnerable audiences, but does so to mask kind of wider political motives. These are kind of quite familiar ideological narratives, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. And that boosts impact of this particular strategy, disinformation strategy. And it's a very successful strategy being deployed by malign actors for political gain. People can move on. So there's something particularly interesting in this form of disinformation where social norms provides an extremely fertile ground for this disinformation strategy. And if you could click on, there is something that the social norms allows, which are these deeply held biases about the role of women in society or the views about LGBT+ individuals, that amplifies and boosts the impact of coordinated and politically motivated spread disinformation. But it also gives us this ideological familiarity, or kind of legitimacy, which really conceals those political motives. The GID also really enforces or reinforces and emboldens these kind of harmful gender norms as well. So there's an interesting interplay in this form of disinformation. It's a really good example of what the literature would describe as grey zone narratives. So it's particular forms of disinformation that feel very organic and very legitimate. If we could move on. And if you could bring, sorry, if you don't mind bringing down the animation. So we think that gender and identity disinformation is actually very urgent, but also quite an overlooked threat. And as MG was describing at the beginning, this is kind of a very important and serious threat around gender identity disinformation, which acts as what we call a multi-vector threat. So it simultaneously does undermine kind of at the individual level human rights, but it does escalate, and that escalation pattern of harm goes from individual to systemic. So at the individual level, we're talking about human rights rollback. So that's psychological harm, which is well documented to lead to physical violence and in some instances murder. It also silences through fear and self-censorship, and it really undermines democratic or civic participation of individuals. But that does have a systemic issue that is degrading democratic resilience and really undermines social cohesion. So GID intensifies the societal divisions and drives dangerous levels of polarization. It also is deliberately used to erode democratic institutions and trust, and that can kind of accelerate democratic backsliding, which we think is obviously something we're really focused on. But in terms of an escalation of that, our final impact, and if you don't, thank you, is that it does have an impact on national and international security. So this issue of this driving deep, using GID to really drive deep levels of polarization, we know leads to social instability, and that is a national security threat because it enables foreign information manipulation. It really creates vulnerabilities by eroding institutional trust, and it weakens Western international alliances. And if we can move on to the next slide, you are an extremely well informed audience. And thank you to those of you who completed our pre-event survey, because it's really helpful for us to get a sense of where is this threat perceived. And it's reiterating this kind of view that we see from broader within the kind of women's rights, LGBT rights space, but also the disinformation field, that actually this version of disinformation or information threat is absolutely seen as a personal threat. I think we've just lost the presentation, sorry. I'll keep talking. So it does, you have responded and seen that it's an individual and societal level threat, but actually it doesn't necessarily therefore escalate and is seen as a broader security threat. So within even this EU DisinfoLab space of very highly knowledgeable individuals, the kind of understanding and link to national security of this form of disinformation is not yet well known. And if we could move on. So it's overlooked, but it's also intensifying, and that is due to rising political extremism and volatility that we're seeing across democracies. As we said, the fear and polarization of using gender and identity disinformation really exploits those existing divisions and really exploits any existing democratic vulnerabilities. And we're seeing that intensify. We're also seeing that because of this interaction with social norms, natural organic amplification of foreign actors' disinformation is being naturally spread, some by aligned domestic actors, but also some totally organic spread. And third, whilst we do see the possibility and potential of AI technologies in helping counter this threat, it's also particularly driving scale and sophistication as a form of disinformation. So, for example, widespread deepfake visual images of female politicians of a highly sexualized nature is being used. So this is kind of like, not only is it urgent and overlooked, it's also intensifying. So just to give you just 2 examples of what I mean by gender and identity disinformation, and if we move to the first. So in Poland, we've been seeing an increase in GID narratives, particularly attached to reproductive rights. And if we could move through the animation, thank you. So GID campaigns that have been spreading disinformation about reproductive healthcare, contraception, and abortion rights in Poland has particularly intensified during legislative debates around these issues, with this kind of narrative that we've seen widespread that claims contraception and abortion really threatens Poland's traditional values and social fabric. And this kind of foreign interference angle is positioning sexual reproductive healthcare rights as a Western liberal threat to Polish values and a kind of undermining of national identity. So it really is aiming to align this issue with a kind of political objective. And this has the broader impact on society of reducing access to these services, but also uses it as a wedge topic to really drive polarization and fear around interference. And the second example is from Armenia. So you'll be familiar with the Istanbul Convention, the landmark treaty that's aiming to legally bind standards to prevent and respond to domestic violence. And in 2019, the ratification was really halted due to growing conservative and political opposition. And again, you could see through a coordinated spread of narratives where it aimed to align this piece of governance, regulatory framework, as a threat to traditional Armenian family values, with claims to eliminate the family institution. And again, using this kind of form of regulation or institutional governance, using a gendered, harmful gender norms attaching to this piece of legislation, which is really aiming to use it as an opportunity to threaten and weaken national identity. So not only is it hindering domestic violence and gender equality efforts, it's using it as a way to undermine institutions. Fortunately, has now passed in Armenia. So those are just 2 examples of what we mean. And I want to just briefly talk about Artemis Alliance and our response to that. So Artemis Alliance is an international network of CSOs aiming to counter GID, to build social cohesion and resilience against this interference. It's a pilot programme, which is coming to the end of our programme. We've been working in Armenia, Georgia, and Poland, and we have 3 specific areas of focus. So to understand GID and how to counter it, to build our local partners' ability to challenge, adapt, and respond to GID safely and effectively. And safely is a very important word there, because the groups that we work with are indeed often the targets of attacks themselves. So it's really important that we work very to secure their and support their own safety in this process. And then the third thing is to deliver insight-led interventions that increase awareness and resilience amongst our target audiences, with an overall vision of cohesive democratic societies where all members can participate fully, free from polarizing divisions and foreign malign actors' interference. So it is the world's first counter-GID network, very, very deliberately focused just on this particular form of disinformation. There's 21 organisations in the network, both international and local, working collaboratively across our 3 countries. And in 2 years, we're building an evidence base. So we're really understanding and mapping this issue, the narratives that are being used, the social norms that are enabling GID to spread and the actors that are behind it. And we are also starting to really understand what is the most effective way to counter this. We've built partner capacity to challenge and adapt to this programme, to this issue, and the programme has supported 21 grants of interventions, research and campaigns to really increase understanding and awareness amongst our target audiences. So I'd love to talk to you a lot about what we've been doing, but actually what I wanted to do more is to give you some lessons that we've learned through the programming. We've had a very, very strong M&E part of this programme because it's such an emerging and dynamic and not necessarily well understood threat. We've really spent a lot of time making sure that we're really understanding what is and isn't working. And I just wanted to share 5 principles for where we are seeing emerging opportunities and success. So the first of those is local leadership is really essential for effective counter-GID response. This won't be surprising to you, but particularly when we're working in highly sensitive or contentious, complex issues, deep local knowledge and expertise is really important. The groups that we work with have existing trusted relationships. They can ensure that the approaches that are being taken in their field are really culturally relevant. Lots of the issues that we're kind of particularly focused on are highly contested or have very low understanding. They also have very strong existing relationships and channels to reach effective communities, particularly vulnerable groups. And because they're in the field and are indeed, as I said, often direct targets of GID, they actually create an early warning system amongst themselves for emerging threats. And just in a sense of what Artemis Alliance has done, unlike other disinformation programming that I've worked on and that we have delivered at Zinc, where we might be focused on organisations in the disinformation space, this is a unique program where we have worked with rights-based organisations. And these are then for operating in a new kind of context for them. So we've been working with them to build their understanding of disinformation and how gender identity disinformation is different to hate speech or misogyny. And we've really taken the groups on this fantastic journey together into counter GID champions in their local areas. So they're recognised voices raising awareness with both wider audiences and allies, and are providing GID briefings to policymakers. Some fantastic examples of research or programmes that the groups have done in informing policymakers. So if the first thing is about working with local experts, the second approach is around how to communicate. So strategic storytelling really is effective, is needed to effectively counter GID narratives and really engage key audiences, particularly conservative audiences. We are competing against an active, well-resourced GID adversary and ecosystem. The deeply held social biases and tensions, we have to overcome those. Sadly, we know facts alone aren't enough, and complex issues need really compelling narratives, but also activations to reach our audiences. And to just give you an example of a couple of the types of things that we've been doing at Artemis Alliance to really break through to those audiences and to successfully reach hard to reach groups or to have culturally relevant approaches, we've done a variety of different initiatives. So everything from, and on this slide you'll see, in using really influential voices like influencers in campaign content, particularly valuable in reaching rural, heavy, particularly dialect groups. Also, we've delivered a variety of different events. We've delivered journalist training, through panel summits, but we've also delivered things like youth exhibitions. So getting young people into safe spaces to talk about complex issues where they wouldn't ordinarily communicate or engage online. So if we've talked about how to go about approaching it, we also want to talk about principles for what we think is really important to do. So the first of those is when you're working in countering GID, it's really, really important to protect targets of GID in order to prevent this kind of human rights rollback. So we know that GID attacks create severe trauma and fear, and that can lead to self-censorship. We know that online harassment escalates to physical violence. Targeted attacks compounds this existing discrimination, and without intervention, this leads to reduced civic and democratic participation and a risk of permanent withdrawal from public life. So it's really important to consider how we're protecting targets. And the types of things that we've done at Artemis Alliance is providing direct supports to targets. There's workshops that we've delivered with female activists, for example. We've also established early warning systems for coordinated attacks, cultivating and mobilizing networks of allies to act as advocates, and then preventing reinforcement of harmful narratives. So, for example, training psychologists and teachers to ensure that they're not repeating harmful GID narratives, particularly with vulnerable groups. Also, it's absolutely crucial that we have direct support for women's political participation in order to strengthen democratic resilience. So targeted attacks turn women's political participation into a really polarizing issue. This intimidation erodes trust in institutions, creates a hostile space that really deter future leaders, and loss of women's voices undermines democratic representation and oversight and accelerates that broader democratic backsliding. So really important to think about protecting participation and ensuring that we are avoiding withdrawal from political life of these groups. And the type of work that we've done at Artemis is providing really practical advice and activities to female politicians, but also we've developed cross-party support networks really to strengthen resilience and to prevent political withdrawal. So that's both closed networks of groups where female politicians have been working together, but we've also done a interview series of content to explain and talk about this issue with very high-profile female politicians. And then the final principle is that addressing the harmful social norms is really essential for long-lasting counter-GID impact. So we know that GID narratives and actors are exploiting and amplifying these existing social norms and biases, and structural grievances provide really fertile ground for GID. So sustainable change requires shifting the social norms and addressing those root causes. And this is where campaigns can play a role. So if we move on to the slide, so actually we have delivered as part of this program public campaigns that is aimed to shift attitudes. So in Armenia, we did a fully integrated campaign which included advertising out of home, TV advertising and social media, which was specifically looking at reducing the impact of GID narratives that framed women as totally unsuitable for roles in peace and security, which was a particular issue that is of great importance in Armenia, but also was being used to kind of drive wedge issues. In Poland, we delivered an influencer-led kind of online campaign that was in responding to the impact of GID narratives, which was really driving polarization and fear of Ukrainian female refugees in Poland. Delivering public awareness campaigning around these issues requires a kind of really detailed planning approach, particularly when these topics are sensitive. So we have a campaigning model where we collaborate with our local partners to really ensure successful campaign delivery, really understanding messaging and this engaging way to communicate. But the final point I wanted to make about campaigning that I think is really important is to actually plan for backlash. In lots of these spaces, activities will become weaponized. There is a well-funded and active adversary. So the lesson here for us was absolutely not to try and avoid backlash, but absolutely to understand what the backlash will be and to plan and for it when it happens, because it will happen. So particularly understanding how actors will respond to this and what types of tools, messaging and strategies they'll deploy, and to preemptively plan for that. So that includes really active monitoring of social media channels and really strong security systems in place to support our partners. I think we're just going to try and play the Armenia video for you so we can explain and you can see it for yourself. Great, thank you, Maria. I'm not sure if the volume came through, and we'd be delighted to share that with anybody that would like to see afterwards. But it was a really fantastic video that got great results. And just to give you a sense of the kind of attitudes that we have been able to shift, if you don't mind moving on, MG. Thank you. So actually, these campaigns ran for a relatively short period of time, but even in that space, we managed to see really quite significant attitudinal shifts. So in Armenia, we saw a 13% increase in support for women in diplomatic roles, and a 15% increase behavioural intent related to the campaign. So that meant that 15% of people were more likely to positively advocate for women in diplomatic and leadership and public roles. In Poland, we saw an 11% increase in people feeling solidarity with Ukrainian refugees, and a 15% increase in the perceived capacity to help refugees, but also an 8% increase in willingness for Poland to continue to support Ukraine. So against this kind of very strong polarizing narrative of creating and spreading fear against Ukrainian refugees, we really managed to see a double-digit shift there, which for a very short period of time, Poland was just a purely online campaign over the course of 6 weeks. These figures are really significant. So just to summarize the 5 principles that I think are really important to share about addressing this emerging threat. Local leadership is essential, particularly when issues are so contentious and sensitive. Really thinking about storytelling and how to engage your audiences. Protecting the targets is really critical on all activity. Specifically thinking about safeguarding or shoring up women's political participation is really important. And thinking about how to address the underlying social norms is essential kind of for longer term impact. And just to say finally, the Artemis Alliance we're building off this pilot. We've got this fantastic foundation of understanding this issue, strong expertise at local level, really starting to build an evidence-based impact framework and methodology, and starting to have influence in terms of shaping policy. Love to talk more about the network, strengthening and joining the network, or strengthening and opportunities for collaboration on interventions So please do contact us. And then I think we can move into questions, and I'll just remind, and we will share this at the end, but we would please do keep in touch with us. We can share much more details in much more private settings in terms of the activities that we've been doing. And I'll remind it at the end to complete the post survey. And MG, thank you so much for that taking us through that presentation. And I'm sorry again that our security systems are too strong to allow me to share whilst we're recording.
Thank you, Kate, and apologies to everyone for the difficulties in sharing. I do realize now that you probably were not able to listen to the audio of the video because I was muted. I did enjoy the audio. Thankfully, it had subtitles. And by the way, speaking of which, as we also share the screen and have so many questions already, it really made me think about the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 about women, peace and security, and how women should be involved in peace and security mechanisms. And of course, that goes without saying, democracy, which is this year turning 25. And I think it's so important to remember that, and it all comes together so greatly. So thank you so much for this very valuable presentation. Without further ado, I will dig into the questions. And the first one that I see on the screen is, how do you see GID evolving in the upcoming years, and what preemptive actions can be taken to counter its spread? An easy one to start off.
Great, thank you, Pablo. So I think that there's something very interesting that we're starting to track, which is the intersecting identities. And so we have so far been looking more broadly at gender and identity-based disinformation. So gender, but also sexuality. But we see, I think, that the way that this will continue to evolve is that there'll be multiple identities that will continue to interact. So we're starting to see, for example, particular versions of race and ethnicity and religion, so other forms of identities being used. I think that the way that we tend to think about it is, what are the most sensitive polarizing issues in the countries, and where are therefore the vulnerabilities that are being exploited by actors. So from our perspective, this is an extremely effective tactic in order to drive deep polarization. I think it's particularly, disappointing to consider that it's gender that is actually one of these most successful ways to drive deep polarization. And I think we've seen an increase in that over the last couple of years. But it's particularly understanding where the fault lines or the kind of particular tensions in social cohesion lie, and that's where I think it will continue to be evolving. And in terms of preemptive actions, I'd say that working with rights-based organisations that really understand these issues is really crucial. And whilst they will have been particularly focused on attacks in terms of gender equality, it's really about understanding and working together around the coordinated nature of this form of information manipulation, and understanding how these links play out. So that's where we are particularly focused on as a programme, really understanding and mapping the coordinated networks and how actors are behaving and interacting with the domestic ecosystem. That's where we're particularly focused on. I think that around exposing and attributing this as a foreign information manipulation strategy is a particularly important thing in terms of preemptive actions.
That's great. Thank you. Moving on to the next question. The other one is more of a comment. So using the extended version of gender identity disinformation instead of the acronym, I think point taken, although we have been kind of reiterating the concept throughout the webinar. It is true that this community sure loves its acronyms. We have to recognize as that. Regarding the other more practical question, sorry, regarding, yes, our, just to mention, our webinars are all available on our YouTube channel or also on our website. Look up for the webinars and you will find all of the recordings. But back to the questions. How do AI and digital platforms contribute to the spread of GID? And what regulations could help mitigate this?
Yeah, so as I said, there is, and for any of you that were also in Riga, like so many of the panel debates and discussions talking about AI and the threat of the sophistication of disinformation being spread using AI tools, but also just the sheer volume. Again, we're seeing particular forms of AI. And again, you will have heard this many times, but the deep fakes and the sexualized nature of AI-based disinformation has a very strong gender and identity-based disinformation element to it. And so predominantly, we know also that the spread of the GID absolutely is prevalent on social media platforms. The regulations, and I think MG particularly thinking about the DSA Act and all the work that she does there in terms of the regulations necessary at EU level, it would be remiss of me to say that it's been extremely disappointing to see the likes of Meta kind of roll back on its moderation policies in terms of safety and security, not least because of AI and increased volume. I think that there's something particularly, again, important about what role can regulation play in terms of safety and security is particularly against this form of disinformation. I would say that there are also opportunities of AI, and we're kind of also particularly thinking about how to harness AI to counter this threat as well. But regulations and policy, sadly, are the route that we will need to take, where perhaps up until recently, we felt that certainly Western-based tech companies had an absolute willingness to go above and beyond and support safety and security of particularly women online.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's kind of disheartening to see how platform mechanisms themselves are becoming sort of a form of interference, and even stepping out of GID, seeing how some platforms played a role in pushing some content over other during elections. So this is definitely an audience dividing and a hot polarizing topic that we can see weaponized in this form. Thank you for the answer.
One thing, could I just add to one thing I would just say is that something that we are exploring is, and again, many people are doing this too, but particularly thinking about trying to raise awareness of this issue with advertising revenue as a channel to try and tackle this. So particularly that's much more on traditional media spaces. But we have a piece of intervention activity we're doing in Armenia, which is particularly to try to build allies within the business community to stop them advertising on platforms that are really regularly spreading GID.
Thank you for adding this. And speaking of the Armenian campaign video, can you elaborate on why exactly you chose to show a woman related to men? I have my ideas, but let's hear it from you.
So really, this is about actually playing into the stereotype. So bringing the opportunity to kind of surprise people, and in case it wasn't clear with the video, and perhaps we can find ways to share it, the video gives a sense that it's the man. This is a traditional view of men in roles of diplomacy and power. And it was this kind of surprise element that we were aiming for. So when we talk about engaging ways to kind of tell the story, it's those kind of moments of surprise and kind of humor in a way. It was sort of funny that it was actually about his daughter and not about himself. And that's why we've seen such high recall and changes and shifts in attitudes, because of the kind of because of the way that we went about telling that story.
Totally, I can see that, and I want to be optimistic and see also an element of allyship there. So even having an older man supporting his daughter. So I thought it was a great video for sharing this message, and also showing how GID can be fought in such an easy way somehow, although the problem is very complex and articulate.
Sorry, just to add one thing there actually, is that it's a really good point, because in some of the research that we've done, it's actually there are some really fantastic advocates that would be unexpected. So sometimes in certain circumstances, we've seen actually like older men are actually aren't as polarized on this issue as you might believe, and are extremely effective messengers. So it's kind of some of our own biases and stereotypes we have to challenge when we're doing the work, and actually finding very effective messengers for complex and contentious issues is really important as a window of opportunity, and that's also was seen in Armenia.
All right. And speaking some more on societal norms, you said that GID is different from misogyny and hate speech. So can you elaborate a little bit on that, please?
So this is the political element to disinformation that is therefore using gender or misogyny. So whilst what is it that makes something disinformation and not just something really horrible? And it's because there's a political motive and it's a coordinated activity. So that's where we see the difference between something that is just classified as misogyny or hate speech, and could perhaps sit much more in a extremely important but technology facilitated gender-based violence policy space, and what is actually a disinformation issue, which is foreign information threat. So our view on this is that we're looking at foreign information manipulation, and it's particularly using gender and identity-based narratives in order to deliver on that political objective.
And I see that the next question sort of relates to that in the, it will probably give you the opportunity to bring out the coordination element and the systematic aspect of it. So what would you say are the key indicators of an online narrative that is being driven by GID rather than organic public discourse, although I'm sure that it really feeds into this public discourse?
So it's exactly that. It's a very interconnected web and ecosystem, and that's what is actually so successful about this form of disinformation as a strategy being deployed. Where we see it's so unlike other forms of disinformation where you get very clear fake infrastructure or deceptive tools and tactics being used to spread activities online. This is a much more networked and organic kind of mapping, but you'll see specific narratives being deployed by certain actors that are being amplified by certain actors who have strong affiliations with foreign governments. And what you'll see is they're using wedge issues or topics that are extremely contentious and sensitive about social issues, and specifically linking them to regulations or kind of policies in order to kind of drive distrust in the governance of the country. So you'll see actors repeating or spreading coordinated narratives, attaching that narrative to a particular kind of piece of legislation, and using that to drive distrust or kind of fear around kind of Western interference or kind of Western liberal ideologies. And that's what kind of is very particular. It is then extremely organic in terms of then its further spread. So some of that more domestic spread will be politically motivated, but might not necessarily have direct or attributable links to foreign hostile states, and some will just be organic spread.
Of course, it's always very difficult to understand the borders between foreign and domestic, especially when malign actors are playing also on local sympathizers. And maybe I take the opportunity for a second of shameless self-promotion. Our audience might find interesting to look up our coordinated inauthentic behavior CIB detection tree, where they can find some sort of indication of checklist of how to spot also in a more descriptive and qualitative way inorganic behavior online. Sometimes there are interesting clues that give that away, and paying attention is enough to find a good lead. But moving on to the questions, the audience asks where and if they can read your research. And I believe that on Slido there are also some curiosities regarding the methodology. So maybe you can give away some of that.
We very happy to share our research. Please contact me, and I would love to talk to you. I think I shared my contact details, but I'll pop them in the chat as well. But we're absolutely happy to share. There's a deliberacy in my presentation where I haven't included details of the groups. We take a do no harm kind of very fundamental approach to this program because of the sensitivities, but we can share in much more private settings. So please contact us, and we'd be delighted to share our research.
That is great to know, and maybe we can take these two questions together, because you have somehow already addressed the limits and opportunities policy-wise. You mentioned the DSA, for instance. So regarding effective policies responses, as well as measures of success, I think that would be a whole other webinar to delve into the topic, but maybe you can say a little bit about this.
Yeah, we actually are in the process of actively researching this issue in terms of the impact of of online spread in terms of affecting female political participation, for example. So it's a piece of active research that we're currently looking into, and then working on ways to think about policy responses in this space. So it's absolutely something that we are focused on ourselves and haven't yet necessarily seen yet responses, but is something that we're looking to test and understand better.
Right, and a very important question, because you are dealing with vulnerable communities, but you yourself, I imagine, can potentially become targets of GID, given your area of work. So can you share some best practices, some safety mechanisms that you as Artemis Alliance put in place in order to handle this backlash and threat by working on GID?
Yes, and I thank you for the question, and it's a really important lesson, I think, and principle in any of this work, particularly when you're working with organisations or CSOs that aren't ordinarily working in the disinformation space. And I would also say this for anybody that's working more broadly in like women, peace, security kind of fields, is to really understand the issue of online harms for any organisations that you're supporting. We do a couple of things. So part of our capability building pillar of activity is really ensuring Anything from IT infrastructure security and safety is in place for the organizations that we're working with. That's very kind of like continually monitored and updated. Then there's personal capabilities and understanding and how to manage yourself online and what measures that you need to put in place in order to be secure. So there's a kind of standardized set of activities that we do around safety, security, and risk mitigation at both the individual and organization level. And then in terms of like the interventions and campaigns, we actively put into the process of developing the campaigns exactly what the backlash will be. So for example, in the campaign that we showed for Armenia, we actually delivered a piece of focus group testing with very conservative audiences to understand how they would react negatively to the campaign messaging. Where we felt we needed to, we maybe adjusted something in our campaign approach or any of the materials or the language. But the other thing we did is really robust risk and mitigation plans in terms of how we would respond to these types of attacks, in terms of and where those attacks might happen. So whether it's on social media platforms and comment messaging, the processes that we would put in place to monitor and understand and react, but also how any whether it would maybe bleed out into mainstream media and how we would respond to any of those criticisms and attacks. So we had a very, very strong risk plan in place that we needed, if we needed to, we actually could deploy. We actually found really quite minimal backlash actually in terms of the Armenia, both the campaigns, much less than we were anticipating. But it was really important that we had the mitigation plans in place in order to protect the groups and the organizations and the before we launched.
All right, thank you so much, Kate. I think that we have to stop our Q&A now, being mindful of time. But I'm glad to see on being more positive about it, that although there have been some questions that remain unanswered, you declared your availability to be contacted, and this also shows a lot of interest from our audience with regards to this topic. So I would very much like to thank you, Kate, and Artemis Alliance. It's been really a privilege to learn about such important work being done in this topic. I would like to thank our amazing attendees also for their patience while we faced some technical issues, and my great colleague Maria behind the scenes, who makes these webinars possible. We have a few upcoming webinars. Please be sure to check them. I promise that they are on our website, despite one of the attendees being skeptical about it, but it is true. The recording of the webinar will be available on our YouTube channel as soon as possible, and you will also find the previous ones. I take the opportunity to remind you that our annual conference will be happening in Ljubljana this year on 15 and 16 of October. And we have received more than 200 submissions in our call for proposals for presentations and panels. So we will definitely sort through them in the next weeks. Thank you for being so active on that front. Make sure to check also our publications. Today we have published a new fact sheet on AI chatbot policies against misinformation. Subscribe to our newsletter. It's bi-weekly. It's a lot of great content there. And yes, let us know what you thought about this webinar. Please rate the webinar. You will also receive, although I'm sure that it's also pasted in the chat, which I don't see right now, a post-webinar survey specifically for this webinar, because we do believe that we have all increased our understanding of gender and identity-based information today. So it will be nice to help also Artemis Alliance to gather some data on that. And with that being said, once again, thank you. I wish you a lovely end of your day or evening, and stay tuned for more content.
Thank you so much, MG and Maria and everyone at EU DisinfoLab.
Thank you, Kate. Bye. Take care.